It's great to see you all today at today's LGBT Inclusion Summit. I'm Tuvia Borak, Global Head of Policy and Documentation for the Global Markets Division of Goldman Sachs. I'm also the co-founder and CEO of the P3 Network, the UK's first and only LGBT and non-traditional families charity. And I'm very excited to be moderating today's panel on what does it mean to be an LGBTQ plus parent. And the angle that we're going to take today is to look at what it means to be an LGBTQ plus parent in the workplace, and how the workplace and employers can better support their LGBTQ plus parents and families. Joining me today are Dr. Frederick S. Klassen-Williams, Global Medical Affairs Manager at Reckitt, Karen Flynn McFarlane, Colleague Experience and Proposition Consultant at the NatWest Group, Kerry Richards, Helpline Services Officer for Mermaids, and Tim Hardy-Lennox, Head of Inclusion and Diversity at the British Red Cross. So, super excited to kick the conversation off. I would absolutely love to hear if each of our panelists can maybe start by quickly introducing themselves and their family unit and how you created your family. So I, for example, am a single gay parent to a now 11-year-old son who thinks he's 14 or 15 most days, and started my family by way of adoption in the UK. So Tim, perhaps we can hand over to you to kick us off.
Hi, thanks. Thanks so much for that, Tuvia. My name's Tim Hardy-Lennox. My pronouns are he and him. My family unit, it's a small family unit, but it's perfectly formed. I have a husband who I co-parent with, and a little boy who's 2.5. We secured him through adoption. We had an interesting journey towards securing our son. We did go through a few different angles. I'm sure we'll touch on different angles to start our family later on, but lovely to be here.
Thanks, Tim. Karen?
Yeah, hi there. Thank you. Karen Flynn McFarlane. My pronouns are she, her. So I am married to my wife, Sharon, and we found a private donor, and we have a little boy, Archie, who is now 2.5. Sharon carried him to term and things. So yeah, that was our small family.
Great. Frederick?
Hi, so my name is Frederick Esclasson. I'm French, as you might hear to my accent. My pronouns are he and him. I married my husband, Jeffrey, will be one of the next panelists in the next session. In 2016, and we recently became the happy parents of an adopted kid with a 20 months old little boy. And I'm currently enjoying adoption leave until the end of the year.
Excellent, thank you. And Kerry?
Good morning, it's Kerry, pronouns she, her. And I'm having to come out as straight. You know, I'm married to my cis husband. I'm a cis woman. And we had our family in the conventional way. And my youngest son, who's now 19, is trans, and that's what brings me here, along with my experience as a helpline operator and being connected with Mermaids for about 3 years now, speaking to many families families made up of many different ways, and parents bringing their own experiences in supporting trans and gender diverse young children. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Kerry. So what I'd like to kick off with is, I think one of the things that sometimes is not understood is that there's a whole coming out journey, I think, for LGBTQ plus prospective parents as they start creating their families. And it involves some really unique conversations in the workplace that differ to what other parents may encounter if they start their families in the traditional sense. Karen, could you maybe share your views?
Yeah, sure. So when we kind of decided to start a family, given that we weren't kind of going down an adoption route, or there wasn't formal processes for us to go through, we kind of kept it incredibly secret we didn't tell anybody what we were doing and why and how and all that kind of stuff. So the first time in the workplace that I actually had to tell anybody was once Sharon was pregnant, and once we'd been for that, I think we actually told people a little bit early. Once we got confirmation through a scan, that's when we told people. And of course, you know, they didn't have any idea of what we'd been doing or going through, etc. So we were incredibly secretive. Probably because we didn't want lots of intrusive questions, but we also didn't want to have to tell people that we'd lost babies or an insemination hadn't been successful, because it's a much more formal process to doing that when you're two gay women. There's no fun involved. So there's a lot more intrusion that comes with those questions. So we wanted to avoid that. So we were quite secretive in the workplace until we had that scan. From my perspective, so there wasn't any discussion on how we were creating our family.
And Tim, did you find you were secretive as well?
Mine was the reverse of that experience. So I started out in one of my roles really oversharing. So we started with doing the route to surrogacy, and we were very open about the different kind of financial constraints. People were very interested in the process. They wanted to understand. And unfortunately, that process fell through for various different reasons. And when it came to our second choice of adoption, we realized just how much energy the process was going to take, 6 days here or another day here, to do a really in-depth analysis of past traumas you might have as a person or as a couple. And I felt a real need to demonstrate to my colleagues that it wasn't me kind of taking or getting any preferential treatment or shirking. I had to say, actually, I need to take this because the policy might not have all of this within its gift, but this is why I have to do it, and really kind of making people understand. So from my perspective, it actually led to a bit of a pattern of oversharing about my journey, to the point where I think there's been some learning of what you edit down and what you don't share through that process.
And Frederick, what was your experience?
I agree with Tim. I was a lot more on the oversharing side also. So I started talking about our will to adopt even before we started the process around me, to make sure that management, HR were aware that's something that we wanted to do. And then I started to give them more information on what would be needed from them or on our side. And everything went perfectly well at work with everyone until I started saying that I needed the 52 weeks. It went still well, but just I could see some reaction, like, why do you need 52 weeks? Because that's really uncommon for a man to take that much time. And I had again to explain that part of the adoption process, you try to take as much time as you can to create attachment with your kid when you enter your family unit. But yeah, definitely oversharing.
So I'd be curious to dig into the oversharing piece, right? And I think it comes to something that Karen mentioned around intrusive questions. I certainly remember when I was starting out, and even today, there's a lot of questions somehow, for some reason, when you're an LGBT parent, that people ask questions that they wouldn't necessarily ask of my, heterosexual colleagues around, how did you start your family, and who's the mother, and from the adoption, what was the issue, and why did they lose their family, and so there is a lot of questioning that gets done. And yes, I agree, people are inquisitive, and inquisitive is great, but sometimes I almost felt like it was inappropriate questions. So what was it that led to the oversharing?
So I think for me that was the need to justify again, my 52 weeks, the fact that I was taking holiday to go to this training, the fact that I was in line for a promotion, but I wanted them to be aware that I was going to leave for all this time. So that was all of that. So I guess a bit of concern because it's still blurry around adoption and parentally for men. So I wanted to make sure that they were aware of all the policy and everything they should do. So that's why I was oversharing, especially with HR. I was starting with the idea: the more you share, the least they can do against you, because you've been really open throughout the journey.
Which suggests, though, that that this fear notion is that you're almost not going to be supported, or that you're going to be singled out.
And I would say yes, but it's not because of the company. My company, again, is great. It's more because I don't have any role model that can tell me what the story was for them and how it went for them in their company. So I've got to, I guess there is a bit of self-preservation there.
And Tim, was it a similar motivation for you?
Similar, yeah. I think there, from my perspective, there was also retrospectively, I realized that I was actually living that out loud and quite openly, because I was seeking support. I didn't realize that at the time. There wasn't a clear role model in society that had been through, the adoption process while in a job, telling you about the intricacies of what might be involved there. So it was really a way for me to seek support without having to have a moment sort of 3 months down the line of the process where I'd have to spend a good hour and a half explaining everything. I could live it out loud and people could see what was happening. So it did, I think, support me, which I wasn't, as I say, realizing at the time was the intention, but I think certainly was a big motivator for me.
And Karen, I know that we spoke, and you have great things to say about NatWest and all the support NatWest offers. In your wanting to keep it secret at the outset, did you have even any inkling of similar fears or reservations that Frederick had around what it means from a career perspective, or asking for leave, or anything of the sort?
So I think when it came to like leave and things like that, I knew that I was going to get the sort of standard paternity leave. I was going to get the 2 weeks irrespective. That the fact I was female didn't matter, although it is called that paternity policy. I think a lot of our decisions around who carried the baby very much came down to that financial perspective, and around who can afford to be off and who has that benefits package, and what the change in that sort of, so if I was to have the baby, the drop in that money financially, from our perspective, that all came into the decision making. But I think that's the same as many other lesbian couples who I've spoken to who have had a baby. But I don't think anything that my work did caused for that sort of secretiveness. I think it was just the way that Sharon and I both felt about the process, and about, there's probably a bit about protecting you from those intrusive questions, and not having to get into it, and not having to explain your reasons why, and lots of different things like that. I think it was a decision that we made together, not driven by work. And then once we did announce that we were pregnant, I think those intrusive questions that we had feared ended up happening anyway. So they came along, irrespective of when we chose to tell people.
So I've heard you talk about a lack of role models, and what support you see around your colleagues, and almost a self-preservation to kind of tell everyone that things are happening, so to roughly explain away why you might have a really emotional day, right? Tim, you talked about the emotional strain of adoption. I remember it was over 100 hours with social workers, and you have good days, you have bad days, depending on what gets touched on. What does that look like in the workplace? What is it that you found is missing from workplaces in order to help support those that are LGBTQ+ and looking to start their families? And what have you seen that's worked well?
So I think from my perspective, I don't think any one organization I've seen gets this entirely right. I think when we talk about support networks of, say, LGBTQ plus networks internally or externally in organizations, there are some networks which are very focused on member support, and there are some networks that are very focused on delivering organizational strategy. And it seems that the two are quite confused. Some of the time they try and deliver both. And I think there's an opportunity there to sort of hone in on what exactly the networks are looking to do. There may be some which can really advocate and support the members on an emotional well-being level. Others may have much more of a strategic remit. So I think that's an opportunity to look into. What I've seen from my own perspective that's worked really well for me is the really informal stuff. So policies and procedures are one thing, and they can be interpreted and they can be flexed, but it's about the behaviors of your line managers, your leaders. I was fortunate enough to have the most amazing line manager when I went on my leave, and that made it all the difference. But I know horror stories of people in other industries that have had the reverse of that. So I think it's how central policies are applied locally and what extent there's compassion within that is really important.
Frederick, do you agree? I think we're talking about two things, right? It's what is the corporate or the business, and then separately, potentially, what is the role of an employee.
So for me, I can talk
time on employee resource groups definitely in a bit, but
I can talk only from my own experience in my company. As Tim say, the policy are there and they are very flexible, but I think at my sense they are too flexible, because effectively that gives too much power to the manager. So if a manager is not really open-minded or happy to comply with what the policy, can interpret it the way he wants. So it's really important that company understand what is behind this other way to have kids. It's not just for the LGBT parents, it's for parents who adopt or parents who get their kid by surrogacy or IVF. And I think right now, at least in some of the company I know, it's very just, we're gonna match adoption and all the other way to have kids to the standard policy, which doesn't work, because I think Karen, you were saying that currently you were taking a father leave, where same for me, if I was to interpret my internal policy, I mean maternity leave. So it's really important that the company put a bit more effort than just matching, and try to understand what is behind this process, what is required.
So what I'm hearing is that it's about understanding, not just the corporate hymn sheet messaging and great policies, but actually taking a step back and really hearing what some of those unique journeys look like. Carrie, from your perspective, looking at families where they have, LGBTQ plus children, and, especially children who are identified as trans, what do you think companies can be doing to help support those parents? And maybe the first question is, do you think there is a role for companies that they should be helping support those parents?
I think there's an opportunity of a lot of learning. I think that possibly many people, it's hard to understand that position, that a parent, the stresses and strains of a parent who is perhaps not even feeling their way in the dark. So as a parent who is perhaps just finding out that their child may be feeling not at one with their birth gender, that a parent can feel total confusion and overwhelmedness. So perhaps wouldn't know what to ask the employer for, when in fact what is needed is real, that word empathy and understanding that is really coming through from today. And it's a real kind of a state of confusion. So how helpful would it be for an employer to have that representation there in the workplace already, for a parent to be able to go to and ask for some help, some guidance, some reassurance? And another word that came through from before when Nikki spoke was about listening. You know, when somebody's feeling a real fear and confusion, then that being a listening ear as an employer, and who better person than somebody who was perhaps already experienced or knew how to guide that person in the right way, or what organisations to signpost them to. It can be a time when it's really incredibly difficult to come into work and to kind of help other people, or kind of whatever demands your job is. It's hard to engage when there's that worry going on at home. And so I think there's an awful lot of scope for employers to be able to offer some more empathy and understanding.
And what have you found has worked well? Like, what are the gold star employers doing by way of offering this empathy? What does that look like in practice?
You know, sometimes I analogy this when I'm speaking to parents and say, there is no wonder this feels hard work, trying to help potentially maybe typically a teenager kind of vocalize and help them understand what's going on for them. And so what would be help, you know, so it's hard. My train of thought is that for an employer to be able to offer some flexibility and having some time away, because it's almost like rebuilding a person. It really is. You know, it can feel like this person needs to evolve, and how am I going to help them to do that? So it hasn't been invented yet, but I really would like a time when an employee can take some time off to encourage, you know, help and support that newly come out person, to kind of invest the time on being in that listening ear. And if there's a lot of information to navigate it when a child comes out as trans or gender diverse.
You raise a really good point, which is, I think, sometimes missed, which is some of those stressors that, you know, LGBTQ plus parents or prospective parents or parents of children who are coming out go through, the headspace that takes up, you know, it will have a toll on what happens in the workplace. And, you know, one of the things that was coming out consistently from all of you is this comment around, you know, support and being felt heard, which all goes to, you know, psychological safety. And that if, you know, employees feel that they are actually heard as individuals by their managers and by their leaders to create a safe space, it actually unlocks the greatest potential in those teams and for teams to excel. So one of the things that was, you know, quite interesting for me in hearing around, you know, kind of the safety and how you feel is something around language. And I find that, you know, there's quite a lot of still heteronormative stereotypes that we see in the workplace, sometimes certain microaggression comments. And Karen, you picked one out, you know, quite clearly in saying that, you know, it's still referred to as paternity leave. What, if any, heteronormative stereotypes or biases do you find you come up against in the workplace as an LGBTQ plus parent?
So certainly for me, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of paternity leave is the one that stuck out for me on that journey. It was very sort of specific, and you know, I remember kind of them saying people struggled to call it parental leave, which was my preference. You know, and they were like, I'm just going to call it paternity because, you know, it's basically that's what it is. So that was probably the biggest one that stuck out for me, where I was kind of like, but it's not. And it kind of brought out that inner rebellious person in me. I was like, but it's not what it is. And I really wanted to kind of shout that from the rooftops. But I know that, you know, for fathers, that 2 weeks can be really important depending on their journey. So it's kind of like, I think it's one of those comments, those things that can be flexed and can be changed. But I think it was that, you know, it's paternity leave, because that's effectively what it is, that was the hardest. That was the one that stuck out most for me. Apart from that, I don't feel like I've experienced too many where we've come up against that. People have been quite respectful in the main around kind of who we are and our roles within our family unit. So, but that was the only one that really stuck out.
Tim, do you find that there are heteronormative biases or microaggressions that you faced?
I think I share Karen's experience to a certain extent, where, you know, some of it's in the language of policies and procedure. A lot of the sort of heteronormative stereotypes that I've experienced haven't necessarily been at work. They've sort of been in the community, like when you take your son to a park and they say, "Where's the mother?" Or you know, even way back years ago, questioning why two men should adopt without a female figure in their life. You know, so it's on a spectrum. So I think because I sort of lived out the journey live, there's been very few heteronormative overt cases that I've been privy to. I think it's just around language, but language is important. And I completely agree with you, Karen, around calling it parental leave. It's so much more inclusive.
And so with what I'm hearing, do you think that there is a stigma? And this is one of the questions that's come up from the participants today. Do you think there's a stigma to being an LGBTQ plus parent?
I think there's a societal stigma. I think I saw the question around sort of oversharing, and is that the reason for there being a stigma? The way that I sort of define that oversharing is it's sort of a learned response. So there's sort of compounded impact. You have a child who may be more prone to having medical needs or physical disabilities if they come from an adoption scenario. And there's always the next thing you need to sort of have a bit more time off for. So sharing kind of all the bits that are going on to paint that picture so people can sort of understand, you know, you're in an exceptional circumstance is what I mean by oversharing. In an ideal scenario, that doesn't happen. You know, everyone gets the same level of flexibility and access to that time. I don't think the world is quite in that place yet. So my sort of own journey of living out loud preempted any questions about why I wasn't here or there or doing this or that. I think that's what I mean by oversharing. Yes, there's probably stigma across other organizations for LGBT plus parents, and I'm very mindful that we're looking at this within a UK context as well. But from my experience, it's been rather positive, but certainly a lot of learning along my journey.
Frederick, any thoughts?
For me, on the stigma, I think that there is a bias here, because I don't think people, if they've got problem with LGBT parenting, I don't think they will approach me and talk to me about it. So of course you can see some looks sometimes when I walk with my son and my husband, but no one is addressing it. However, I can feel like there is a stigma in being a father that is also the main carer of his son, because that people got no problem at addressing it, or they were gonna approach me and ask me if I'm the nanny even before asking me if I'm the dad. Also led by the fact that I'm not the same ethnicity than my son, so people will make a lot of assumption even before assuming that he's my adoptive kid. And then I've got to explain the route and a lot of things that would probably not been asked to straight parents who had their kids the standard way.
And so, do you see any do you think that LGBTQ plus parents or parents of LGBTQ plus children are treated somehow differently by colleagues, right? So move away from the stigma point. Does it ever impact work relationships with colleagues? Carrie, any thoughts on that?
It's something that really stuck out to me actually when and is across the board, that I think that it's so hard as a parent to choose when or how to tell people that your child is going through a journey with their gender. And when it comes to colleagues and employers, so often, as we've already talked about, colleagues are often the people who are really, you are going to hope that they are going to support you through difficult times. And actually, when you share something like this, other colleagues haven't had experience of it. Other colleagues do not know any one of their friends who've been through it, and so it's really, really rare that people know what to say. People, I think that, and that is sometimes what's difficult, even if your child is okay for you to talk about this within your workplace with colleagues. I think that not only have you got that, it may be in your question and not, are they going to judge me about my support that I'm giving my child? And I think that obviously belongs in the earlier conversation about stigma. But also people just don't know what to say. There's a silence rather than, are you okay? Is there any support I can offer you? Is there anything that, actually I know of this organisation that might be helpful? There's just silence, sadly.
But what is it that we would hope to see, right? I think silence sometimes can be okay rather than people trying to fill the space, right? It's okay to feel uncomfortable sometimes, right? People sometimes have had uncomfortable reactions, or I see stares when, they find out that I'm a gay parent, because it starts raising a lot of questions and people want to ask them and realize that they can't, or, some of the comments that, Frederick, you made around, the fact that a man's going to be a primary caregiver, right? And what that looks like in the workplace. So what is it that you all think would be great that we would want to see from allies, right? What do you hope the comments would be? Would you love to see by way of support if you are sharing information?
So from my perspective, there's probably a specific thing in mind, and a general thing. The specific thing, for me, it's really important. When my husband or I are referred to as the adopted parents, for me, that's a real sort of knife in the heart. Like, no, I'm his dad. I'm not his adopted dad. I'm his dad. I'm all his known. So for me, that's a really, it's the power of language again. And that's something an ally can really just change very easily. I don't think we're quite comfortable talking about emotional impact, but hopefully that helps from a specific perspective. From a general perspective, this is with my I&D hat on, inclusion and diversity, really taking out the heteronormative stigma from caregiving. And that again comes down to language and policy. So if I look back at all my experiences with my son, it's been just an assumption about who gives that primary care and where is the mother, which has been the root of a lot of our conflicts with people in society. So helping people to, whether it's through nudge tactics like policies, procedures, learning, or just conversations with individuals, challenge those stereotypes when you hear them. Don't make it call people in rather than call people out. I guess that's my advice.
Frederick, Karen, any thoughts?
For me, or Karen, maybe you want to go.
Sorry, I think that probably the specific one is quite similar to what Tim's just said there. I think as a lesbian couple, I think sometimes people use the term dad for sperm donor, because it's all they know, right? And I get that, but it's that use of language and inclusive language, and I find the term dad when talking about my family, is a bit of that stab to the heart, because he's not a dad. He had a very specific role in the process. He was the donor. He did what he needed to do, and then that's been it. Actually, doesn't have a dad. And then kind of the follow on from that, like, oh, he's going to teach him boy things. It's that kind of thing about only a man can teach a boy things and only a girl can teach a girl things. We need to kind of think about that language and think about, that family units are different and they're changing, and you rely on support from a lot of people. But as you say, pulling people in and kind of like thinking about the words that we're using and how we're talking about family units when we know they're different. I think the assumption can often be, there's a mum and a dad if you don't know us. But once you know us, we need to start thinking about those conversations in a much more inclusive manner, which would be the thing for me.
I think for me, the difference would what the allies need to do, or if they want to present themselves as allies, questions what is the motivation behind their question, because sometimes they can have genuinely need for understanding, and sometimes it's just an intrusive curiosity, and I'm not there to keep answering to their question about my life. That's so sometimes it can feel very intrusive and very difficult. So on the 52 weeks, again, keep saying why I was taking the 52 weeks is because my husband makes more money than me. I don't want to keep sharing this information to everyone, and a straight couple would probably not have to disclose this kind of things. So it's, ally really need to, before opening their mouths, try to question themselves, and is this question okay? Is this question not how would I feel if this question was asked to me 10 times in the week? Because it's not the one occurrence that is a problem. It's the fact that there is a lot of employee that comes with the same question over and over again. And I think that would be important. And on the adoption side, I would like people, because the problem was not that much intrusive question, that was more intrusive information that people were coming with. Everyone got adopted people around them all of a sudden when you start talking about adoption, and everyone got an awful history of adoption when you're in the process, and they come and they feel the need to share that with you, which is always a bit difficult.
And Carrie, do you agree? I'm getting this constant theme around language, and it's the language that folks use.
I think that there's perhaps it would be nice to see a lot more awareness around what it feels like to be a parent of a trans or gender diverse child. I think there is an awful lot of lack of awareness, and I'd like to see employers kind of enable their colleagues to have more awareness around, and visibility is a lot. I know that we've already discussed that, but I think that, I guess, is because being a parent of a trans or gender diverse or non-binary child no one sees that. When you're in the workplace, unless you've seen it. No, so we're one of those people that if you have got something on your desk or a lanyard that shows that they're an ally without that kind of language, it can really kind of take some of that pressure away and help you feel like there's more people around that you can approach if you are not having a good day and then struggling.
And what specifically, if I may ask, would be a helpful response that for, if you are coming out to a colleague to say that, what you are dealing with at home, that your child is identifying as trans and has a lot of questions around that, and you as a parent have questions, if you share that at work with a colleague, with a manager, what is the most helpful response rather than the silence? What is it that you would love to actually get and hear back?
Really, I guess you just want it. And how is that going? Is there anything extra we can do for you? you know where we are if you need us. I think much in the same. It's an enormous event if it's kind of just happening, and So no, I think I'm acknowledging in that first, those early stages when, as a parent, you're trying to, kind of find your own feet in it as well. That it can really help for an acknowledgement of, gosh, that must be quite a big thing for your family to be dealing with. It has a ripple effect, and how is that going? We're here as for support if you need us.
Great. Before I turn to the next question, I invite the audience and participants to please continue to keep your questions coming in. We've had some great questions, and I'll continue farming them out, so keep them coming. One of the topics that was raised was around visibility. And, a question around support and how do you feel supported if you don't have role models? And that always raises the question for me of, does that mean that, if there aren't others around, do you feel that there's an obligation on you to role model, to stand up, to overshare what is happening in your life, to talk about your family unit, the issues and whatnot, so that you can be the role models that didn't exist for you? Karen, any thoughts?
So I would say in my instance, definitely. So I had been the co-chair of the Rainbow Network and got really comfortable about talking about my story to do that role modelling, because I know there's been LGBT parents in the bank before me, but I don't know who they are because they weren't really vocal, which is totally fine because I think it depends on you. But I think at times, if like I would get told, oh, such and such a person is having a child with her wife, you should go speak to them. If they haven't been really open about it, it feels really weird to walk up to a stranger and go, hi, I've been told that you've done this, want to talk about your journey, because it's far more impersonal and you don't know if they want to share. But I think for me, when I didn't have that role model, I thought I need to kind of talk about it. I need to join people together and kind of just be open, because having someone who's spoken about their journey first makes it really easy to approach them and say, oh, I saw this article or I saw this post that you posted on social media. Any chance I could grab a coffee? I think it's much more easy to approach someone when they've been open first, but it very much depends on role models. So it's not to say the people before me were wrong, because I think it's still okay to be private, but I think it's also helpful to those that potentially come later and who want to start a family and who don't know where to begin or things like that. So I definitely felt it was important for me to be open and honest, and we started a little Rainbow Families page on our social media internally, and that was just to kind of get the conversation started or see a network of people who can talk about it and help you.
Tim?
Yeah, definitely for me, I think it was important to, as I say, sort of live that out loud. I knew there were people before me who had gone through a similar process. Again, I didn't know who they were. And from my perspective, being in inclusion and diversity, I wanted to be very clear about, I'm bringing my whole self to work here, and it's good to do so. And, look at me kind of thing, not in a totally vain way. But for me, it was more about two things. One, actually, the processes of, say, maternity leave, adoption leave, shared parental leave, I found them hugely confusing as they were. And I was looking, maybe not a role model, but some practical, someone who'd gone through it to answer some practical questions about what do I do with shared parental leave versus adoption leave versus paternity. And there's really not in many organizations that I've seen a great appreciation and understanding of all those intricacies. So if someone's gone through it, it's hugely helpful. The second thing, from sort of living a role model kind of journey during this process, is it's been quite exhausting. So within the adoption process, you do, as you say, over 100 hours of time with social workers. You could lose children. you get your trauma re-exposed and then go to different panels to defend how you've overcome that trauma. And having to do that at the same time as, this is a very normal thing to do, and we're all okay, and we're just having another family in a different form. It does take its toll. So for me, it was really important to defend my own mental health simultaneously within that process.
Frederick, any thoughts?
So for me, I wouldn't say that it's felt like an obligation, but there is more a willingness, yes, to inform people and to give as much information on my journey as possible for the one, either LGBT parents, but also adopter in general, for them to have an understanding of how it works, and for them to know that if they've got questions, they can approach me. I was actually asked by my company to write a small piece in the context of Pride Week that will be published on our intranet to explain that. And I was like 100% up for it, because, yeah, as I say, there was no role model for me, and I want to help whomever needs this help that I couldn't have at the time.
So one of the things that we talked about earlier was, what companies can be doing and should be doing. And I'd like to flip the question now to, what do you think employee resource groups should be doing? And is there a role here for LGBTQ plus networks to be supporting their people and their community, or is it sit more rightly within a parents and carers network? Because as LGBTQ plus parents, we straddle both, right? And so, sometimes the sentiment is, well, from an LGBTQ plus perspective, some of the issues you're dealing with are probably sit better in a parents network, whereas a parents network might turn around and go, but there's so many LGBTQ plus issues there that we don't know that we're the right support place to be. So I'd welcome your thoughts on the role of employee resource groups, and which employee resource group. Who'd like to kick us off?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. I think there's definitely, so we've got a Rainbow Network and a Family and Carers Network. I think there's a role for both to play, and there's a role that they can kind of join together to help kind of bridge some of those intricacies. I think it's fair to say when we were going through the process of conceiving Archie and him being born, there wasn't an awful lot within the Rainbow Network that existed to support rainbow families or LGBT families. So that kind of closed them off to me. And I think there was probably a bit of nervousness about the Families and Carers Network for me, and that I wondered if things were going to be different. So I would probably sit on the outskirts looking in and wondering, is this for me, is it not? So I wasn't terribly sure at that time. But the networks do have that role to play, and I think there has to be that understanding that there's differences and similarities, and there's times where the Rainbow Network for us will be the right place to be, and there's places where the Family and Carers Network will be the right place to be, because there's no point in them duplicating effort and doing each other's kind of roles and not focusing on the specialisms. But as I mentioned, we probably started a little Rainbow Families group on our social media where people could just talk about their stories, and we were talking about going to Pride with the kids, and when we took them out in any local groups that they knew of. A few of us were in Scotland, so we could talk about those kind of things. And that was the part that I felt was really missing from the formal employee network that we had, was that communication with others like me. They could maybe share stories, but it didn't feel as structured or supportive, and we don't have like a Facebook page where it says that they're LGBT part of the Rainbow Network and they're a mum or a dad, or anything like that. So it's moving on in the bank. I think there's a lot more kind of cross collaboration, but I think that's the way that it should be. And I don't think that I should only go to the Rainbow Network because I'm LGBT. I think understanding who to go to and when is really important, and that's where the networks can make that really clear with their communications. A bit jumbled there, sorry.
And Kerry, what are your thoughts? Because you identify as heterosexual, right? Mm-hmm. So as a heterosexual parent, does it feel more comfortable and you think you should be supported by, a parents and carers network, or because that's where, you may be understood more, or because your child is trans, that, it is the role of an LGBTQ plus network to help support?
I found it very difficult to find anything specifically appropriate, actually, and hence, particularly that an employer could offer. I don't know whether that's my experience of working for when my child came out. I was working for quite a small charity. There wasn't anything that they could provide. It was certainly more so the national groups that were available to me, and hence why Mermaids was a stop-off point for me. But there absolutely seemed like there didn't seem enough support in my eyes, particularly because there was a great amount of mental health issues that were a great concern for us at the time. It felt like I had to access a great range of support charities that are available for parents, and not any one of them, not any one of them other than Mermaids felt right for me. So it didn't feel particularly easy, really. I think that having a wide range, and how important that was for the wide range of networks that I access myself, would also be, open-minded and non-presumptuous about their parental, how those parents presented themselves, and didn't limit their access to the support they were offering people.
And Frederick, do you agree? Is it the role
So
of multiple networks?
In our company currently, we only got the LGBT network. It's really new. They are developing ERG as we speak. I think the role of the ERG for us is primary to help the employee. So to make sure that when we talk about role model, for example, the ERG should be the place where you can go and ask for people with similar experience, share experience that can help you, because that's where you will find them. Then they can help the company in the writing of the policy. But for me, I insist that the company need to make the effort first, need to dig, need to do the research, and need to come with something that is a final draft for them to present to the RG, that can probably tweak and say, oh, maybe we can improve it. But the RG shouldn't be the source of information for the company first, because that would be kind of offensive for me if the company come and say, well, I've got no knowledge of your specific needs, because you are out of the norm, so please let me know. That's not my job, and that shouldn't be the job of the RG.
And so, Tim, wearing your DE&I hat, not as an LGBTQ parent hat, what are your thoughts, especially on the point Frederick just raised on, the responsibility should sit with the company and not go to an ERG to say, help us understand and explain this?
I think it's a balance. So I think you need to have lived experience to inform approaches, but that needs to be beyond tokenistic, and it needs to be beyond just something transactional. So if, for example, we were to redo the adoption procedure and we just consulted people who are heterosexual, we didn't involve the LGBT plus network, I'd find that to be a really missed opportunity, because there's obviously a disproportionate amount of LGBT people who may use adoption when compared to the same ratio of heterosexual individuals. So I think, yes, there is some reciprocity that needs to be expected from both sides. I don't think it's a complete product that needs to be delivered from either one, but it's a partnership which needs to be developed. And I think that's where it comes to the purpose of the resource groups. As I sort of started to mention earlier, how far is a network set up to support groups of individuals, and how far is it set up to deliver corporate aims? And I often find that the two are quite confused and try to deliver both things. So maybe they're both done half as well as they could be. And for me, when it comes to the resource groups, I couldn't agree with you more, Karen, around, go to different ones. I found it so helpful when I adopted my little boy. He has some serious conditions in terms of disability, to have a talk with people in the disability network about how did you manage this. Don't limit yourself to that one box. There is a wealth of experience across all the networks, and even people who aren't in them but are open about their experiences elsewhere.
Excellent. Tim, a question's come up in respect of your comment around trauma and the trauma through the adoption process, and whether you can just elaborate whether you felt you had a toll on your mental health because you were being challenged as to whether or not you would be a good parent because of your sexuality, or whether you meant something else.
It wasn't specifically about sexuality. So the process goes quite in depth about any kind of trigger points that you might have throughout your process. So anything from divorce in the family right through to something very, very serious that might involve sort of a criminal investigation or something like that. And they do want to understand how you've reached resolution to all those things. So when I talk about re-exposing that trauma, for a lot of people, it can be a really happy process to sort of go through the adoption procedure or have a child in a different way. But there is a need to appreciate that for some people who have complex mental health or have experienced incidents in the past, the need to relive those, and maybe you haven't reached a resolution to those before, the need to do so in order to progress within the adoption process is really challenging.
Thank you. And I think the way I would describe it is, it almost felt like, therapy sessions every single time, with the social worker digging in deeper, and what does that mean, and why did you have that emotion, and how have you dealt with it, and so on and so forth. So we are coming up to time. I know we could keep going for quite a while. What I would maybe appreciate by way of wrap up is if each one of you could just share a thought, either at what you think your tip is for allies to help support LGBTQ plus parents or prospective parents, or what you think employers should be doing. So you can choose one or the other. My takeaway in listening to all of your perspectives has been, it's almost so elementary, but it seems to be so complicated, which is around language and actually listening. And I think sometimes people get scared to actually listen because it might make them uncomfortable. And being uncomfortable is not a bad thing, because ultimately we are talking about families, and we are talking about humans and people in the workplace. So, Carrie, could I ask you to maybe kick us off? So one thought, either for allies or employers.
Absolutely, because I did speak to some of my colleagues, after I knew that I would be the straight folk in this. I made sure that I spoke to some of my colleagues who happen to be of LGBT experience themselves, whilst being a parent. And a couple of things cropped up, as also did for parents of trans, non-binary or gender diverse children, and that is confidentiality. And again, I think, like you just, of course, we all have, it's a confidentiality policy, there it is, it's clear to see. It might be something we talk about each time we have a training session, but are people practicing that confidentiality? And when it comes to such delicate issues of parenting, I think particularly, I think when a child is trans and a parent is worried about how they're supporting their child, I think there's some real fragile moments about what confidentiality looks like, and when people can assume that it's okay to speak about gender and gender identity, when in fact check things out with people prior to sharing it with one person. Doesn't mean to say that you want it shared with the rest of the team. And so if I could just kind of touch on that, really.
Yeah, confidentiality, excellent. Frederick?
So I would say, like I said earlier, question the motivation behind your questions before asking them. Me disclosing my family unit to you is not to go ahead for every type of questions because I don't have the time to educate you on everything. So is that a genuine question, or is that just like basic curiosity? If it's genuine, I'm happy to talk to you. If it's just out of curiosity, well, go on internet and Google it.
All right, thank you. So stop us think. Karen?
I think the biggest thing for me is what we've probably spoken to is an awful lot about language. I think it's looking at those policies and making the language really clear, or allowing a bit of flex to make the language a little bit more inclusive. So not necessarily taking away anything, but, you know, making it really clear that a paternity policy is for, you know, all parents who are not the birthing parent. You know, just making that a little bit clearer is really important. And I think having that understanding that you know, people have a particular desire around how it's spoken about. So as line managers, be really open and discuss that language as to how, you know, people want to be discussed or spoken about, or what the role they're taking on and how they want to talk about the policies and what they'll be doing and why. I think line managers have to have that supportive ear and really understand the flex that's available in policies.
Thank you. And Tim?
Mine is around extending some personal grace and extending some flexibility when you're speaking with and interacting with people who are going through the process of securing a child, or even after one's been placed with you, or you've received it through different means. Each stage can be a big battle in the moment. You know, everything from writing your final report in your prospective adopter's record right through to the final court case. There's a lot of different battles you take along the way. So if someone is checked out a little bit at work, you don't know what's going on beneath the surface. So just extend some personal grace in that. If they take another couple of days because of a policy, is that the worst thing in the world? Think through those kinds of things within sort of a compassionate approach within an HR framework. And if you're a manager who's managing someone going through this, put as much flex in as you can, because we can all do better in supporting people.
Excellent. A big thank you to all of you, Kerry, Tim, Frederick, and Karen, for sharing so openly with us all today. A big thank you to all of our participants. Thank you for joining us at the Equality Leaders LGBT Summit today. And it just leaves me to say have a great rest of the day, and you will now be breaking for a networking session. So thank you very much, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.